Maxwell awoke to that same flicker that had been taunting him for several years now. It glowed just outside his bedroom, slightly bigger than the flaming wick of a candle, but nearly identical in shape and somewhat foggier, even on the clearest summer nights like this one. He had first asked his mom about it when he was 6 years old, and she quickly brushed it off as just some light coming from the neighbor's house. But Maxwell kept insisting that it was much closer, just a foot or so from the vinyl siding, seemingly floating above the narrow strip of grass that separated their property from the Petchman's house. Maxwell's father then laughed at this detail and deduced, "Sounds like you're seeing Mr. Peckman having a cigarette after he comes home late at night." He then lowered his brow and made contact with his wife. "Mr. Peckman might be swaying a little bit when he gets home and has a cigarette. I bet that's your flicker, Max." Maxwell's mom laughed as well, not out of humor but pure disdain, and added, "Probably smokes half a pack before he feels ready to go inside the house the way he shows up home. Did you see the skid marks he left on their driveway the other week? Not to mention the way he tore up our side grass with his truck right back around Christmas." But it was not Mr. Peckman, for Maxwell saw no man, and not even a silhouette outside his bedroom window. Just the flicker, glowing and radiating and floating up and down like an almond-shaped orb, yellow-orange and soft on the edges. Maxwell did often hear the sounds and commotion that his parents had spoken of in regards to Mr. Peckman and his late-night arrivals at home. The roar of his truck's V8 and the occasional thud of its front grille concussed the plastic trash can where he overshot his landing. Maxwell would hear Mr. Petchman's coughs and spits and belches and even his streams of urine into the bushes. And yes, he would look out to see him smoking a cigarette at times, but never, no chance could that be confused for the flicker. Mr. Petchman was twice as loud as the flicker was soft, and rarely did he stay outside on that narrow driveway for longer than a couple of minutes. For Maxwell would then see the lights come on next door and often hear crashing from inside the house, followed by yelling and crying and everything that made him realize with each year older why his neighbor Spencer Petchman always seemed so much angrier and volatile than the other boys at school. Maxwell and Spencer had been fairly close as young boys, playing in each other's nearly shared backyard spaces and riding bikes down the sidewalk as they aged. Maxwell had even asked him about the flicker once, and he knew Spencer's bedroom looked down from the second story of his own house right into the space outside Maxwell's window. Spencer had looked at Maxwell confused. What? No. Then completely changed the subject. But around 9 or 10, the boys diverged paths. Spencer fell in with some junior high kids, got into fistfights, was even brought home in a police cruiser once after an incident with spray paint and the fences at the nearby Little League field. Maxwell and Spencer were on fine terms and would still talk here and there, but they certainly weren't close when the incident occurred. The flicker had been waking Maxwell now for nearly all his conscious years, yet it never crossed his mind to confront the image. At first, he had been too scared, not just at the prospect of going out into the darkness alone, but the fear of consequences he might face from his parents for unlocking the front door at night. They don't live in a dangerous neighborhood per se, but car break-ins were not uncommon, and his father always seems to highlight in casual conversation about how that rough North End is only a few blocks away, really. But on this night, with the thick humid air and 3 a.m. temperature still stubbornly stalled in the mid-70s, and Maxwell now a young man of nearly 11 years old, he quietly turned open his door, crept through the living room, slipped on his rubber sandals that were left by the door, quietly unlatched the deadbolts, and entered alone into the nocturnal version of all that was so familiar. Maxwell rounded the corner of his house that faced the Petchman's driveway, and he immediately saw it floating there still outside his window. The flicker. It appeared so much brighter from out here, nearly the size of a toy football, and as he gazed on it with wonder, it was as though the flicker somehow noticed him noticing it. He swore that he saw it turn towards him and look straight into him. With no eyes, but simply that familiarly haunting glow, he stepped closer to it and felt compelled to call out, "What are you?" Maxwell extended his arms and held out his hand to touch the space it occupied, but just then the flicker abruptly jerked to the right, planted itself firmly in the middle of the Petchman's driveway, and Maxwell followed. He reached out yet again and found himself enveloped in full-on beaming light coming from his back. He turned and it shone in his face, but it was too late for Maxwell to move out of the way of Mr. Petchman's truck. Maxwell was knocked unconscious immediately, and he nearly died in that driveway before an ambulance could even arrive. He swore, though, that he retained a memory of lying there on the warm asphalt, staring vacantly upward towards the flicker as it floated just above the hood of Mr. Petchman's truck. It was never really asked of Maxwell what exactly he was doing in his neighbor's driveway that night at 3 a.m. Rather, it was explained to him by doctors and psychologists and lawyers and various specialists that he had experienced a state of somnambulism, likely triggered by ongoing night terrors. Maxwell did not ever mention the flicker to anyone. It all seemed very far off and distant from the following months of hospital stays and physical therapy and courtrooms. Not many questions whatsoever were asked of Maxwell. Those were instead directed towards Mr. Petchman, who supplied in a series of interviews, depositions, and sentencing hearings that he was a severe alcoholic with 2 previous DWI convictions, a history of domestic violence, and that he had been drinking vodka Red Bulls down at CJ's Tavern that night until the bar closed, before barreling into the 10-year-old neighborhood kid Maxwell and slurring a call to 911. Maxwell felt somewhat wrong going forward so full bore with the charges and lawsuits. He knew that for all the man's faults, he was still Spencer's dad, and deep down, even at his reckless drunken speed, how could Mr. Petchman have expected anyone to be in his driveway at that hour? Maxwell's dad even questioned their course of action at times. "He nearly killed my son, but we are definitely ruining his life." But the medical bills alone warranted the lawsuits, and the prosecutors sought to make an example of serial drunk drivers. Maxwell never even had to take the stand. Mr. Petchman was sentenced to 5 years in prison in front of Maxwell, his father, and his mother, while on the other side of the courtroom, a terminally worn-down Miss Petchman wept dejected tears. Spencer stood in front of her in a clip-on tie, and a gold cross pendant pierced through his left ear. He looked the same as always, disinterested and angry. The years of adolescence would pass, and so would the wounds upon Maxwell's body. As he healed, memories of the flicker seemed to fade away with each milestone of recovery. By age 15, Maxwell no longer even needed the routine checkups on where surgeons had repaired his spinal column. He rarely thought about the incidents and never about the flicker on its own. It seemed to be firmly lodged into that one night, completely cut off from the years of memory that preceded it. Maxwell moved on with his life unquestioning. The Petchmans moved on as well, quickly selling their house to pay for lawyers' fees. Maxwell had not spoken to Spencer since the incident, but not by intent. Upon moving, Spencer transferred into the schools on the North End, where he gravitated towards an even tougher crowd. The last Maxwell ever heard of Spencer was that he had dropped out sometime in 11th grade. Nothing much was heard of the Petchmans beyond that they divorced about a year into Mr. Petchman's sentence, and that Miss Petchman would often berate his name amongst the same old crowd as CJ's. On multiple occasions, too, it is said that she would curse Maxwell and his family for ruining their lives. But even her most strident allies found it to be a line of reasoning hard to fully go along with. The settlement paid out well to Maxwell and his family. While a future of community college and continued lower-middle-class substance had awaited before the incident, Maxwell found himself with the opportunity to attend university and his parents with the ability to purchase boats and vacation rentals, a ticket to the world of excess they had always dreamed about. When Max was nearing the end of his studies, he got word from a high school acquaintance that Mr. Petchman had died. In the ensuing years after his release from prison, he hit the bottle harder and harder, struggling to ever find his way into the world beyond that one night. He passed away in the cab of an older model Ford Ranger that apparently he lived out of, his only real possession. Maxwell felt awful upon hearing this. The acquaintance who had told him expected him to be somewhat relieved, as though Maxwell feared Mr. Petchman's split-second assault on him to last into perpetuity. The truth was, Maxwell had hardly thought about him at all in nearly a decade. He hadn't even considered whether he had been released or not. Maxwell's thoughts briefly went to Spencer, or truly, the faint ghost of a memory of the boy he had once lived next to. He felt sorrow on a human level, but wondered more out of sick curiosity how bad Spencer had turned out. And at that very thought, of voyeuristically gawking at the hypothetical shitty life of a childhood playmate, another image popped into Maxwell's head. The flicker. It danced about his consciousness, glowing just as it had before the headlights swallowed it whole, just as he had once imagined it floating above his mangled body as blood poured from every crack on his face, and the bitter taste of what he now knew was spinal fluid filled the back of his throat. Maxwell closed his eyes tighter and tighter, feeling just as afraid as a boy first seeing it at 6 years old, and upon realizing the tension in his face, the flicker was once again gone from his memory for many years. Maxwell was quite successful in the world of sales. He traveled around the country and lived the life of a wealthy young bachelor. He leased a luxury apartment on the top floor of an old building downtown, converted from old ethnic tenements in the name of urban renewal and access to an unsurpassed view of the city that had all but demanded higher rents. Maxwell had lived there just over a year, having moved in with the first wave of new tenants around the renovations. He loved the place, but routinely spent many nights away on business. Late one summer evening, as he rode the elevator up from the gym in the building's basement, Maxwell casually checked his phone, thumbing through the different apps for notifications that he may have missed while working out. Nothing of note, really, but one thing caught his eye under the banner at the bottom of Facebook titled Friend Suggestions. In a line of semi-familiar faces was the name Spencer Petchman, below an overly pixelated logo of the superhero The Punisher. Maxwell immediately lurked about the profile, but could gain access to very little of his photos or posts due to privacy restrictions. He saw that he still lived in town, in a suburb on the outskirts of the North End. He could view 3 pictures from the past 7 years, each one displaying a new level of decay. "He looks awful," Maxwell said to himself, immediately feeling bad for even feeling the need to think that. Upon entering his apartment, Maxwell couldn't shake the curiosity toward Spencer's life, both genuine and pervasive. He thought about requesting him for a moment, but wasn't sure how it would come off. He scrolled once more through his profile and saw that he had 25 mutual friends. What the hell, Maxwell thought. We all grew up together. He hit send request and went to take a shower. Upon toweling off and beginning to dress, Maxwell saw the red notification indicating that Spencer had not yet accepted his request, but sent a message in reply. He opened it up. "Seriously? Fuck you. Look like you're doing fine after everything. Fuck off." It shouldn't have been a surprise. It was exactly the reason he had questioned even sending the request. Yet, still, it burned Maxwell deep down to know that Spencer held so much anger towards him. But the burn did not linger, rather, it shifted force. Maxwell then said out loud to no one, "No, fuck you. Your drunk-ass dad nearly killed me. Good riddance." Maxwell threw himself on the couch and gazed off into the cityscape. The glowing lights were such a natural backdrop at this point that it is surprising that he even noticed it there. The flicker, hovering just inches beyond the thick glass. Maxwell stood astonished at its return, another traveler of the past into this mundane night. It had not changed after all these years, or maybe it did. Was it not deeper in its hue, less yellow and turning towards red, like the last bit of fall leaves before the decay set in fully? Suddenly, Maxwell grew angry at the flicker. It had tormented him as a child, and now it thinks it can simply come back decades later to taunt him again. Maxwell ran into his kitchen and grabbed a broom. He popped open the corner window that vented just enough to let a breeze in and stuck out the handle in the direction of the flicker. He poked and prodded, and the flicker jolted back and forth. Maxwell laughed, dark and bitter. The flicker then shot into the sky up to the roofline. Maxwell could still see it there, suspended just out of reach from his broom. Incensed now, Maxwell stormed out of his apartment and up the stairs to the rooftop garden space directly above him. He stomped towards the edge and craned his neck over the wrought iron fence. The flicker was right there below him. "Hey!" Maxwell screamed into the din of the city night. the flicker serenely rose up, placing itself eye to eye with Maxwell. He took a breath and his body relaxed. The flicker grew in size, and just as that night not 2 decades ago, it was as though it looked right within Max. He reached out his hand over the black curve of the fencing, and just as his fingers touched the flicker, it began to fall from the sky, and Maxwell fell too, over the fence and 20 stories down onto the concrete. Maxwell died immediately upon impact, but he swears that he still saw the flicker floating above him, just in front of the entryway to his apartment building, as that familiar bitterness filled his throat, and darkness came over everything from here unto eternity.